We all complimented the iPad Air 4th generation for having the same design and features as the iPad Pro, which is great, but unfortunately it's still difficult to reach in terms of price for many people. So instead, I've been checking out the iPad Air 3rd generation, which is a little bit more accessible, although it still sports the older design and a slightly older chip. But I've been really impressed with my usage over the last couple months, and I think I'm ready to say whether I recommend this to folks. So let's talk about it. This is NOISO, and this is the iPad Air 3rd generation review. Although the iPad Air 3rd Gen sports the older design, frankly, I think I prefer it. While I do visually prefer the design of the newer iPads with kind of the sharp edges and the small bezels, in terms of ergonomics, I actually prefer this design. Something about the curved edges along with the larger bezels means that it's easier for me to hold on to when I'm typically watching content. And I have more motivation to use this like a typical tablet while holding it in my hand, rather than setting it up with a stand or clicking it into a Magic Keyboard. Something about the design of the modern iPad Air and iPad Pro just makes it look like it's designed instead for landscape rather than portrait orientation. And if I'm going to be viewing a device in landscape mode, generally I prefer a laptop. Now here, instead, this is clearly more meant for portrait orientation, and so it's more meant for holding in your hands while you're sitting down on a couch and browsing Twitter or whatever it might be. I actually find myself switching this to landscape orientation a lot less, even when watching videos, just because I like holding it in my hand naturally. The other big thing that differentiates the design of this from newer iPads is the presence of the older Touch ID home button, which I actually don't mind at all. The newer iPad Air has the Touch ID sensor baked into the lock button, which, although I haven't tried, I haven't had the best luck in the past with lock button Touch ID sensors. And then the newer iPad Pros obviously have Face ID, which I'm perfectly fine with, but frankly, I usually pick up my iPad or unlock it with my hands anyways, so I don't mind putting my finger down to unlock it with this rather than using Face ID. One small downside of the home button for me is that gesture navigation is slightly different on this than newer iPads, in that you can't quickly swipe between open applications and can only use the swipe up to go home and swipe up and hold to see open applications. But that's a small change, especially considering that I've been using this iPad primarily as just a tablet. And frankly, that really takes me into the usage of iPad OS. While Apple is still working on kind of porting over a number of features that you would traditionally see in laptops, thankfully they haven't actually marred the experience of using iPads as a tablet through those features. And I'll draw a parallel directly to Windows 8, which unfortunately sacrificed a lot of the experience of using Windows laptops as laptops for the sake of a touch interface. But thankfully that's not the case as far as I've seen with iPad OS. I'm interested in trying out some of the new features that Apple is bringing to iPad OS in the next generation in just a couple months. But frankly, unfortunately, as long as I'm just using my iPad as a tablet, they're not going to make a big difference in my experience. And frankly, there's not a lot of things that I really need to change about iPad OS. It unfortunately has a lot of the same issues that I experience with iPhones, but that is more of just my preference now, and rather than a significant hampering to the experience. One other downside to having larger bezels is to have a slightly smaller screen. I can't really tell the big difference between the iPad Air 11-inch and this, and frankly the screen sizes are close enough such that I'm fine with either one. But of course this isn't going to have any of the newer technologies that you'd expect out of newer iPads. The iPad Air 4th Gen doesn't have a high refresh rate or a variable refresh rate, but the iPad Pros that I'm used to using do have up to 120 Hz refresh rate. Now, personally, while I love the difference in experience in the UI and swiping through applications, frankly, once you get into watching videos or reading content or anything like that, which I tend to do on tablets more, the 120 Hz really doesn't make a big difference for me. I think this screen is absolutely excellent. It's got a peak brightness of around 500 nits, which is great in most scenarios, and it's got great colors and sharp enough such that I couldn't notice a difference. After trying the iPad 8th generation last year, I honestly could never go back to a non-laminated screen. And thankfully, this has a laminated screen, which means that there's no air gap between the display and the glass surface itself, which is absolutely great. For most people, they won't have any problem with this display. The downside for me of having a front-facing home button is instead in gesture navigation, where unfortunately, while swiping up from the bottom will take you home and swiping up and holding will show you your open applications, you don't have the ability to quickly swipe back and forth between applications on the bottom of the screen. Unfortunately, that is reserved purely for home buttonless iPads and iPhones, which is still very bizarre to me. Thankfully, most of the other features of the software have been brought back, and that's just very, very respectable. And so the experience of using iPad OS on this is mostly the same as what you would get on a newer iPad. The first that I'll call out is specifically around opening YouTube videos when going from the Twitter application, which still sends me through a navigation of Safari and then opening in another window, all kinds of crazy stuff, when in reality all I want to do is tap on a YouTube link in Twitter and it open the YouTube app. And yes, there are solutions for this, but I've never found a consistent solution that works across all applications. If you have any recommendations, please let me know down in the comments. I did take some time using this device for more professional needs, like being able to edit a photo in Photoshop and then doing all the same things that I tried in my iPad Pro 2021 review. But unfortunately, I met many of the same frustrations, and even more so considering that this has a little bit more limited horsepower. Now, I was able to edit photos in Photoshop and make thumbnails, which was great, but ironically enough, if I switched away from Photoshop and opened YouTube or even Chrome sometimes, unfortunately this wouldn't be able to keep Photoshop in RAM, and unfortunately when I switched back, it would have to reload the project that I was working on. That is not the greatest experience for what Apple is trying to drive to be a multitasking device. Generally, I would say this is very much a single tasking device, unless you might be able to research a paper while you're writing it in another application. I've also been using the first generation Apple Pencil with this, which sports many of the same features in software as the newer Apple Pencil, which is great. But unfortunately, it seems like my Apple Pencil battery is dying because I have to charge it way too often. And considering the charging methodology of the Apple Pencil on the older devices, it's a real pain. But it's nice to be able to have that as a feature. Does the iPad Air 3rd generation make sense in 2021? I'd say generally yes. I was very impressed with the performance of this, and it's a testament to Apple's ability to keep hardware and software strong, even several years after they come out. This came out in 2019, but it feels a little bit older because of the design, but the performance wouldn't reveal that. In terms of using it for higher level things, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you were looking for a great tablet, it does make sense. But you have to look at it in context with other devices in the market. The iPad 8th gen goes for somewhere around $200 and $250 for used or refurbished model, where this comes in at $300 to $350, and then the newer iPad Air 4th gen comes in closer around $450 depending on where you get it. This sits very nicely between those two models, but I would take this over the iPad 8th gen any day, just because of the laminated display. When I was comparing this to instead the iPad Air 4th gen or the newer iPad Pros, like the iPad Pro 2018 for example, it's a little bit tougher choice to make. I might go for the higher end model just for the sake of longevity, having a device that might last more years into the future. In terms of design, I prefer this over the more modern design, but if I was more worried about a device that could stick around for quite a few years, then I might make another decision. Let me know down in the comments what you think is the best iPad Air for you, and whether it makes sense to have an iPad Air 3rd generation in 2021. I can't wait for you guys to see more of the videos coming up, so be sure to get subscribed if you aren't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.